All right, here we go. Thank you. So today we're going to talk about best practices for lead-based paint transactions. And if we can go on to the next slide, we'll get started with that. Feel free, Carlin and Kim. It looks like you're the only two agents on. I appreciate you joining me. Okay, so this is when you are representing the seller. Always send the F-318, the seller's broker's notice to seller of seller's obligations regarding lead-based paint to the seller. And so this is a form that you would send. I would also send this along with, if you are representing the seller, always best practice when you're getting your listing agreement signed to go ahead, if the property is subject to the lead-based paint exhibit, if it was built prior to 1978, then I would go ahead and get them to fill that out along with any disclosures they're offering and this notice to the seller. It doesn't require their signature. It just requires yours as a notice to fill out the forms that you have sent them. Okay, next slide, please. You guys raise your hands and ask questions if you need to. I love that. Okay, also representing the seller, always send the F-316, which is the lead-based paint exhibit that I just discussed, disclosure of information on lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards in purchase and sale transactions. This must be filled out by the seller first and then provided ASAP to a prospective buyer. Technically, guys, this is supposed to be reviewed and signed off on by the buyer before an offer is ever made on the property. I know sometimes that's not realistic, but if you get this form and it is uploaded to your FMLS, Georgia MLS listing, along with the disclosures, then I would consider that fulfilling your obligation. And it would be up to the buyer's agent to review and sign off on this form prior to making an offer on the property. All right, next slide, please. Zena, yes, we're talking about only if it's built prior to 1978. Representing a seller, also send them the CB04 lead-based paint exhibit, which is protect your family from lead in your home, or to the buyer or their agent. When this pamphlet is emailed to the buyer's agent, it's considered to be delivered to the buyer. These pamphlets, guys, are really, really important because they are basically free legal advice for our clients. And so make it a habit, if this property is subject to lead-based paint and lead-based paint exhibit, make sure you're sending them the CB04 lead-based paint exhibit brochure. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so if you're representing a buyer, here is our buyer's broker notice to seller of seller's obligations regarding lead-based paint. I would say that if I'm representing a buyer and the property is subject to lead-based paint exhibit, we know it was built prior to 78, I would always send the F-317 buyer's broker's notice to seller of seller's obligation regarding lead-based paint to seller. Please note that this is really only required if the seller is paying the buyer broker compensation directly, but that may or may not be negotiated. So it's best just to email this notice to the seller's agent, which should be considered delivery to the seller. And I would just get in the habit of sending that automatically, really, because it's so hard right now to even know up front what the seller is offering, if any, if they are paying their listing agent and they're sharing, or if they're paying the buyer's broker directly. So just a good habit to get into sending this It never hurts to over disclose, even if it's not required for a particular transaction. While it's legally the seller's responsibility to deliver the CBO4 lead-based paint pamphlet, make sure you also send that to your buyer. And we're really suggesting all of this, guys, because the fines on these, the fines on any infraction is $10,000 or more. And we really want you all to be very cognizant, particularly since we live in Atlanta, where it's a historic city where we have so many properties built prior to 78. All right, next slide, please. Also, if you're representing a buyer, always email the F317 buyer's broker's notice to seller of seller's obligations regarding lead-based paint to seller and initial section G, which is highlighted in green right here, on page 2 of the exhibit. And again, I'm going to reiterate, this is only required if the seller is paying the buyer broker compensation, but that may or may not be negotiated. So it's best just to email this notice to the seller's agent, which will be considered delivery to the seller. And again, while it's legally the seller's responsibility to deliver the CBO4 lead-based paint pamphlet, please make sure you're sending it to your buyer. All right, next slide. All right, that's it regarding lead-based paint. You guys have any other questions or any other topics? We've got plenty of time if you have some other issues you'd like to discuss.
Tom, I did have a question. If
Sure, Carlin.
I was working with an investor, and one of the properties that we were looking at, I think a wholesaler had sold it to someone or whatever. So everyone, no disclosures, no pay, nothing. This is as is. As a person representing the buyer, I mean, I know that this home that we're looking at is 78 or older. Is there a particular way we are supposed to handle that to protect everybody?
I would just send them the buyer's notice to seller of their obligations under the lead-based paint exhibit.
Okay. Thank
and
you.
So at least you've covered yourself and your buyer. Right. And if the seller doesn't cooperate, then that's really on the seller and the listing agent for not providing that information.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, of course. Zena, you have your hand raised.
Yes. Hi, Tom.
Hi.
Hi. Since Carlin asked this amazing question, can you please explain to us a little bit about when there is a wholesaler involved? I know it's double closing, and our buyer will buy the assignment on the contract, but who gonna sign the document, the seller or the wholesaler? And if there is any tip you can give us when we are in situation where a wholesaler involved in the transaction.
Yeah, I'm going to answer that the same way I answered Carlin's. Our duty is just, if you're representing the buyer, is to send that notice to seller of their obligations under the lead-based paint exhibit. And then that way you've covered yourself and you've covered your buyer by sending that notice.
Yes, but not only about the lead-based paint, about everything else. So is it usually the seller sign our offer or the wholesaler?
Well, if it's listed by an agent, the agent should be advising their client about their obligations. And if I mean, here's the thing: you either if you're working with somebody and they're not disclosing, you don't have to buy that property. You can move on to another property, because I have found, just by being a broker for so long, that people who don't want to disclose, there's something there that it's either being hidden, or there's some other issue that we may or may not know about. And sometimes it's better under the cooperation just to walk away from that particular transaction and find another piece of property. Does that make sense, Zena?
Yes and no. So let's say the client is very, very interested in the house and the wholesaler seems okay, but they are missing some disclosures, which we understand. But the question is just the process of the double closing. That's what my question was. The double closing. We are negotiating with the wholesaler, but at closing, the wholesaler will purchase it from the seller directly and sell it to us, or we will be purchasing it from the seller, which we never had any signature from during the contract. If that
Well, wholesale properties are a bit more complicated, and the wholesaler, if the seller, actual owner of the property, is not signing documents, that wholesaler doesn't have the right to sell that property, and because they don't own it.
Right, my understanding they are signing the assignment, their right to purchase, not the house. They are selling their right to purchase the house. I understood that from Angie. Just because I went through several times and we terminated just because of this confusion. But now my client are looking at a property. They disclose that it has a equitable title, and when I search it, that what it's mean. It's mean a wholesaler involved in the transaction. So my client, of course, asked me, Zina, explain to us what wholesaler, what this mean. So I just did some research. I told them what I know.
Well, you have to understand the wholesaler, if they're just selling their rights to the property, they do not own that property. And
Correct.
so you're dealing with a situation that where somebody is selling a right to a property they don't own.
Correct. Correct. Yeah.
So, I mean, if your client still wants to go down that path and buy that property, then basically it's they're risking it's a big risk.
Can you give me just example what they are risking? Because I think a closing attorney will not will handle it and they give them remarkable title. But what else they risk, please?
What else do they what now?
Risk. Like they are risking exactly what?
Well, they're risking the fact that I mean, this is really, in my opinion, no different than well, it's a little bit different, but I mean, they're risking the fact that they're buying a property from an entity that doesn't really own the property. And so if something goes wrong at the last minute, then they're not going to be able to secure that property. And the wholesaler is not going to disclose anything about the property. So the biggest risk, in my opinion, in purchasing a wholesaling property is that you're buying something that you have absolutely somebody is signing documents on something they absolutely are not going to disclose anything about that property. And that's a big risk, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you.
Again, sometimes, you know, I think that we have to do a really solid job of explaining what buyers are getting into under these types of circumstances. And sometimes it's better for the buyer in the long run to find a property that is not under those guidelines, because a wholesaler is not the owner of the property. And so you're not going to get a straight answer out of a wholesaler on any property that your buyer may purchase.
Yes, thank you so much, Tom.
Okay, any other questions?